Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today is a little bit of a different video just on account of the fact that I don't often do anthology reviews, and when I do, I don't often do two of them at once. But today we're going to be covering some Rick Riordan, yet again, covering some supplemental material rather than one of his main series like I've been doing on the channel up to this point. I believe I've reviewed Percy Jackson and the Olympians now. I've reviewed the Kane Chronicles, I've reviewed Heroes of Olympus, and then I believe also the trilogy of short stories that are the combination of Kane Chronicles and the Percy Jackson universe called Demigods and Magicians. Now we're going to be doing the Demigod Files, the Demigod Diaries, and the Singer of Apollo as a random independent short story that isn't in either of those, but is a, short supplemental piece that kind of takes place sort of in that same time period and along those same kinds of lines. So that is the purpose of today's reviews. Now, this is basically all reread stuff. I have read Files and Diaries before. I read The Singer of Apollo in a random anthology collection of something several years ago, so I've read all of these stories before, but it may as well have been a first read just on account of how little I remembered about the collections. So let's talk about them all now, beginning with the good, in which case I'll talk about the good of basically all of this stuff. I think if you like Rick Riordan, this is more Rick Riordan, and it's more Percy Jackson specifically, so you're likely to enjoy it all. In the Demigod Files specifically, which should be read after Percy Jackson and the Olympians, the letter from Camp Half-Blood as a conceit for the existence of the Demigod Files is convincing and decent. And then you have basically the bulk of that particular collection. You have Percy Jackson and the Stolen Chariot, Percy Jackson and the Bronze Dragon, and Percy Jackson and the Sword of Hades, 3 short stories that all kind of take place more or less within the series of Percy Jackson and the Olympians. There's one of these that seems to take place after, one of these that's a little bit more questionable, and then one of these that's a little bit more simple, kind of like the mid-era of the series. And by mid-era, I don't mean like the mediocre era, I mean like literally middle of the series. I think all of the actual short stories, all of the actual Percy Jackson stories within the Demigod Files is great. If you really enjoy Percy Jackson, and especially the stories that are specifically him being the narrator like the main series, there is a lot more that you're going to enjoy from this collection. Stolen Chariot is a little bit simpler, a little bit lower stakes, still pretty great. Bronze Dragon is a little bit higher stake and also more exhilarating, but taking place within a familiar yet also somewhat new kind of terrain within a familiar area, namely Camp Half-Blood specifically. And then the Sword of Hades raises the stakes a good bit and also actually incorporates an element that would go on to be utilized within the Percy Jackson sequel series, the Heroes of Olympus. So in that way, Sword of Hades is kind of like a recommended read in between the two series, just on account of that particular element. By no means necessary to understand it, but you may find that you're a little bit confused about where one thing came from and why it's referenced specifically in a certain way in Heroes of Olympus. It's just like, wait a minute, that didn't happen in the series, and it's because it happens in this particular short story. But I think that these Percy Jackson stories are good, and if you enjoy Rick Riordan, you're going to like them. In the Demigod Diaries, which should be read after Heroes of Olympus, you have a little bit more of a diverse collection of stories, which is cool in one way, but also makes it a little bit more whiplashy in another way. You have a great story in the Diary of Luke Castellan, which unfortunately, I gotta say, does struggle a little bit with Riordan differentiating Luke's narration from any other first-person narration in the series. He doesn't feel any more distinct from like Percy or even Carter Kane, for example, than I feel like he should. He should feel like he's different, but he just feels like your standard first-person protagonist, and it's a little unfortunate for that short story. Not a deal breaker or anything. The story itself is good, but that is a rather unfortunate downside to it. You have a story called Leo Valdez and the Quest for Buford, which takes place technically after the Lost Hero. You have Percy Jackson and the Staff of Hermes, which is a story that feels like it's starting off pretty low stakes, but then ends up pretty high stakes in the climactic section of it. And that one's really fun and enjoyable in its own ways, and is also a little bit different for Percy Jackson's story. Like, it follows a lot of the same type of tropes that Riordan tends to use within that quest line, you could say, side quest, but is also feels a little bit more unique and diverse than some of the other stories. Something like the Stolen Chariot or the Bronze Dragon feel like standard Percy Jackson fare, where, like, aside from reading the titles of those stories, you could scarcely even really remember the real importance of them. They're just kind of little romps of the tale. Staff of Hermes feels a little bit more consequential, even though it's mostly not, and that's okay. It's just that it feels that way, which is cool. You have also a short story not by Rick Riordan in the Demigod Diaries. You have one written by his son Haley called Son of Magic, which is still set in the universe, is still, I believe, technically made to be canon on account of kind of its placement here, but also a very good story that you can tell is written by, I believe, an at the time 16-year-old in a couple of the ways certain things are worded and written. But aside from that kind of stuff, it's super impressive. That story is. I really enjoyed that. I remember it being my favorite part of the Demigod Diaries when I first read it years ago. In fact, it was the only part of the Demigod Diaries that I like explicitly did remember. It was the only part of either of these two collections that I explicitly did remember to any degree, and I see why. It's still quality. It's still the best story within the Demigod Diaries, so that is also pretty cool. And then we're going to skip talking about Percy Jackson and the Singer of Apollo for now, because we're going to be talking about that at the end of this coming section, the bad. There are unfortunately some weaknesses to these two collections and certain inclusions that I don't really care for as far as the conceit for the collections in general. Obviously, in the Demigod Files, you have a solid number of like interviews, in-world interviews that the author supposedly did with some of the characters in the Percy Jackson universe, more specifically within the Percy Jackson series, but like all of them are super short. Some of them are just a couple of pages long. They don't do anything. They feel pretty useless. Even as supplemental material, they don't really say anything that you didn't already know or put together yourself in your head. So they don't reveal anything important. They don't even really give any personality to the characters that are being interviewed. So I just felt like they don't really serve a purpose in the collection. That's a little unfortunate. And then Demigod Diaries, you have another interview in there, but it feels a little bit more like actually tied in with the story that precedes it. So there's at least that. But even that I didn't really care for a whole lot. The letter from Camp Half-Blood in the Demigod Diaries, as the conceit, the setup for that book, is a little bit more mediocre. It doesn't feel as solid. It doesn't feel like it makes as much sense as the Demigod Files, as kind of like an external piece of writing from Rick Riordan as a contact of Camp Half-Blood, so to speak. It didn't come across as what's the word I'm looking for? It starts with a V. Anyway, I can't figure out what the word is. It doesn't feel as authentic. It doesn't start with a V, it's an A. That's the word I was looking for. It doesn't feel as authentic as the letter from Camp Half-Blood for Demigod Files does. So, like, that was a little bit whiplashy for me starting it. And then furthermore, aside from that letter, you also have a note from Rick Riordan in the middle of the book that introduces Son of Magic. And like, obviously I understand why from a more meta real world perspective, totally makes sense to include this note. It's just like, hey, this next story coming up was actually written by my son and explains some things that like I hadn't even thought of as ideas for this world that are pretty good and cool ideas, and I really like them. I hope you enjoyed the story. I'm really proud of that. But it doesn't really fit with like the overall supposed existence of the story, especially when you have the letter from Camp Half-Blood in the beginning being like, I was entrusted with these things, doing the whole like in-world reason why this exists type of romp. And then you have a letter, another note from Rick Riordan in the middle that's just like, hey, let's completely break the supposed existence of this in-world just to talk about like the next story being by my son. Like I said, I obviously understand why it exists, but it means that this entire collection as it stands is much less effective. It is much less believable. It is much less authentic. It feels a little bit more spotty in that way, and I didn't really like that very much as a result. Both Demigod Files and Demigod Diaries include some other things that I don't particularly love as well, including various puzzles and photos. Now, that's not to say that this is bad or that I don't like that they are included, because like the puzzles and stuff like that, they're obviously targeted more as like the middle grade audience that would ideally be experiencing these things for the first time. That's totally okay. But there's also the fact that like including these in a Kindle edition of the books doesn't really work. Maybe they would work on Kindle Scribe, but like otherwise the digital editions don't really make sense in that way. Physical editions like from a library, for example, don't work that way. But if you had your own physical editions for your kids, like that would work, and that would actually probably be pretty cool for them. I enjoyed being able to do that kind of stuff when I first read these years ago, but as kind of an adult reading them, they just feel like filler space in these collections. And like I said, that's kind of more, and I guess obviously that's a little bit more like of a me problem today reading these collections rather than an actual problem with the collections. But you know, they don't really feel super substantial for what I want from supplemental material from the series. Like I said, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's okay. In going into like photos and stuff, like this isn't a bad thing at all, actually. In fact, having character and kind of like a scenery art and stuff like this is really good. I think that it is a good thing for books and series and authors and whatnot to actually have art depicting their stuff. That's a really cool thing. But I didn't feel like it was incorporated super dynamically or really anything more than just like, okay, here's now some art that was commissioned for several of these characters in the book, and that was basically about it. Didn't feel like it actually served that much of a purpose. Like it does supposedly in world, like they're given descriptions that make sense in that way. It's just I didn't really need them. It probably would have been cooler to have an entire like art book or something like that, but you know, that's just kind of grasping at straws of like problems to have. It's just that where I wanted a collection like short stories, or where my current self wants a collection of short stories, to have some of this other random supplemental stuff thrown in now and again in between stories, you know, not fully for me. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I'm going to throw it in the bad because where else am I going to put it? For the ugly, we have a little bit more of a problem, and I guess I kind of lied earlier. We're not going to talk about the Singer of Apollo in the bad. We're going to talk about that in this section. That's because the ugly of these collections and the Singer of Apollo is that continuity and timelines get really, really messed up here at certain points in time. Sometimes it's a little bit more forgivable. It's like, okay, but there's a couple examples that are actually like really questionable in that, like, Rick obviously did not consult anything, not even his own wiki, to figure out what is and isn't continuitingly that's not a word, but you know, what does and doesn't actually fit the continuity of the universe that he has built. And of course, these obviously aren't really meant to fit like hard and fast rules insofar as you know, like characters make jokes and make references to like certain pop culture stuff throughout the books, given that The Lightning Thief came out in like 2005 or something like that. And then you have like Heroes of Olympus in the mid 2010s, even though they're only, you know, a handful of years apart in world. The fact that some references are going to be kind of inconsistent between this as a rule, the meta stuff. And like, that's okay. Like, I'm not going to be bothered by that kind of thing. But when you have blatant obvious continuity errors with like things that are actually applied to your story and applied to your characters, that becomes a little bit more of a problem, a little bit harder to justify, in my opinion. I'm kind of a continuity bum. I really don't like when, you know, retcons or continuity errors happen, at least when they're so obvious that it's like, there's no way that this thing can actually be possible. Like, you should pay more attention to what you're doing so that that doesn't happen. But yeah, there's several problems with this in some of these collections. Percy Jackson and the Bronze Dragon from Files has a little bit of continuity error in that, like, it's kind of hard to determine whether it takes place in one particular summer or a different particular summer in between a couple of the books. I forget if the question is whether it happens before Battle of the Labyrinth or before The Last Olympian, or if the question is if it happens after Battle of the Labyrinth or after The Last Olympian. Like I said, I kind of forget, but there's certain details included in the story that make it like kind of hard to place in either section, because if you put it in one summer, like there are references that wouldn't make sense because of the next summer. Or if you put it in the next summer, there are references from the previous one that therefore wouldn't make sense. So it's, you know, a little bit of a problem in that respect. It's not horribly offensive. Leo Valdez and the Quest for Buford also has a minor timeline glitch in that, like, it takes place after the The Lost Hero, the first book of the Heroes of Olympus. And there's a reference to, like, the quest having ended a couple of months ago, even though it actually only takes place like maybe a few days after that book. So there's like, this should have been a pretty obvious detail if you remembered what your own book did. So that's kind of a problem. That's something that, like, my brain fixates on. And that, like I said, even this example isn't offensive. It doesn't change anything about the story, really. It's just like one passing mention of, like, oh, this thing from last couple months of work or something. It's like, yeah, but if you were paying attention to your own writing, you would have realized that that doesn't actually make sense. But The Singer of Apollo, Percy Jackson and The Singer of Apollo, this independent short story, it's an entertaining story, don't get me wrong. It is fun for what it is. Reading it, I did not, like, dislike it to really any degree, but I have a major problem with the fact that it does not fit anywhere at all, not a single place in the timeline. There are so many continuity errors in this story between the Percy Jackson series, between Heroes of Olympus, Trials of Apollo. There's maybe a little bit of Demigods and Magicians, but maybe not quite so much that. There are just errors in the story all over the place that make it literally impossible to fit into the timeline. You're like, you can't really fit this in this particular month because it would have to exist after this month, which is several months later because of these references. But if it were to be there, it would literally be in the middle of some of this other stuff that's already happened. Like Percy would be missing in this point in time or something along those lines. Like, there's a lot of problems. Yeah, there's a lot of continuity errors in this story, and I'm not particularly happy about that. It really actually affected my enjoyment even while reading. I said it was entertaining and it's fun for what it is, but, like, I noticed enough problems in there that I'm like, this does not fit this timeline even a little bit. This is like, maybe this story is just a dream type of thing because it couldn't have happened actually. But now we're going to move into the recommendations since I've been rambling and ranting a little bit too long at this point. I recommend the Demigod Files to you, if only for Percy Jackson and the Sword of Hades. Like I said, it actually fills in some of the gaps in between Percy Jackson and the Olympians and Heroes of Olympus, namely Bob, the character Bob, if you know, you know. And that makes it a little bit useful in the continuity of the series. It's not necessary, but it's also a good story. Like I said, the other two Percy Jackson stories in there are good. I recommend the Demigod Diaries, solely for the Son of Magic. There's some of the other good stuff in there, like if you really enjoy Rick Riordan, there's no reason to not read all of the new material in that, but Son of Magic is very good. It is very impressive, and even though it is pretty obvious it was written by a 16-year-old, it is quite impressive and interesting. As kind of a thought experiment, it is totally worth reading that one, even though I would say I like the Demigod Files more than Diaries. The Singer of Apollo, though, it doesn't really matter. Like I said, there's so many continuity errors, you can't really place it in the series, and it doesn't actually incorporate any new information, any reveals, or anything of that sort that is really useful for the series as a whole, so it won't actually affect anything. And I think that it is so rough around the edges there that unless you're like super into this universe that Riordan has created, you don't really need to read it, especially since you can only get it independently or in one particular anthology. It's like, I don't think it's too worth getting the anthology, and spending a couple bucks for this story is not necessarily worth it unless you're like hyper fixated on reading all of the Riordan stuff. But as a rule, none of this stuff is at all really necessary. So, you know, if you don't want to go ahead and read any of it, you don't have to. I should say that at least for the last couple years, basically, the Demigod Files and the Demigod Diaries have both been on Amazon Prime reading. So if you have Amazon Prime, you can read those for free with that membership. So there's at least that. If you happen to have the membership and you're reading Riordan stuff, you can read those at no cost. Don't really recommend Singer of Apollo, though. So there's that. Anyway, that's the end of this review. Even this one started to get out of hand a little bit. All of these things are ending up way longer than I ever intend for them to, and I apologize for that. But if you're curious, like I kind of started off this video telling you what I've already read and therefore reviewed for Rick Riordan's material with like the major series and whatnot. What's next up on my plate for the Rick Riordan reading journey as I'm kind of doing that on BookTube? Well, next up after these, at some point here in the near-ish future is going to be Percy Jackson's Greek Gods and Greek Heroes books. Those two I actually haven't read before to any degree, so those will be amongst the few Percy Jackson verse stuff that I haven't read at all. Well, I guess there's plenty of supplemental stuff that, like, especially stuff that happens like after Trials of Apollo that I haven't read yet, but this is the last of like the Riordan stuff here in this universe that I haven't read yet for now, basically, because following those two like collections, Percy Jackson's retellings of certain Greek myths, I will be going ahead and reading Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard will be the next thing after that, in which the first two books will be a reread. The third book will be a partial reread. Be mostly new though. I think probably half or 2/3 of that book will be new to me, but most of that trilogy will be a reread at that point. And then after that, I'll finally get around to Trials of Apollo, which I admit I have some pretty severe reservations about. We'll see what happens with that when I get to it. And I'll obviously update someday, trademark, when I actually read all of that stuff. But that should be all for today. Thank you for watching if you did. For now, I have been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.